joining us now to discuss Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator, thanks for joining us. So a potential default could now just be 11 days away, theoretically. President Biden said today that he's done his part. Now it's time for Republicans to move. How worried are you that a catastrophic default could actually happen? And do you think Republicans who are negotiating need to be willing to move more?
Well, a couple things. First, I think the president needs to show leadership. He took about 100 days to gauge, to kick in, and now that he's finally negotiating, I'm pleased that he's doing so. But I also want to point out that Secretary Yellen's comment about when default occurs, potentially as early as the 1st of June, but it could be later. Well, let's have a little leadership. The financial markets are all nervous about this. Is it the 1st or is it the 14th? A quarterly payment of taxes comes to the federal government beginning on the 15th, at which point the risk of default is averted. So the president just needs to step up and calm down the markets by being specific. And lastly, the president has been jacking up spending his first 2 years of the presidency. Now he wants Republicans to accept that as a new baseline. I think Republicans and the American people are reasonable to say, Mr. President, just because you have artificially inflated spending for the first 2 years of your presidency, by the way, giving us all kinds of inflation to boot, does that become the new baseline? We don't think it necessarily has to. And I think Republicans are reasonable to ask that it be reset back down.
Yeah, you're referring to the fact that the White House, according to reports, offered to, as part of this negotiation, offered to freeze spending, I think, at 2022 levels, whereas obviously McCarthy and the Republicans negotiating wanted it to be frozen at earlier levels. The House Freedom Caucus, a group of very conservative Republicans in the House Republican Caucus, they're saying that they're going to oppose basically any compromises to the original legislation that they passed. A majority of the House Republican Party, we should note, voted to not count electoral votes from Arizona and Pennsylvania based on election lies, lies that you've stood up against. Do you think the House Republican Caucus can be counted on to arrive at a reasonable compromise in these debt negotiations, given that fact, that ugly fact that sometimes they take pretty extreme positions?
Well, I think that I have strong feelings about the last election and how that transpired, but nonetheless, I think that's a totally separate issue. And let's give a tip of the hat to Kevin McCarthy. The package that he sent to the president, he had Republicans voting for a debt ceiling increase who had never previously voted for a debt ceiling increase. And I don't think we can allow anxiety, existential anxiety about the future to kind of dictate what is done today. Once Kevin said in a private meeting, never ask me to do something because you think I can't. Let me first go out there and see if I can. I think the president needs to step forward, make an earnest effort to meet Republicans and the American people on the issue of lowering our indebtedness. And if they do so, let's see what McCarthy can do. And I'd like to have more faith in Kevin.
President Biden also said this morning that he thinks that he has the authority to lift the debt limit on his own using the 14th Amendment, though he said it's unclear if he has time to use it given all the legal challenges that would ensue. The amendment says, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned, unquote. I know you don't think he should do this, but do you think he's right that he has the ability to use the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling on his own without Congress?
I'm not an attorney. It does sound like he's kind of squibbling around a little bit. His left wing wants him to invoke it. It's one more example of the president taking the constitutionally delegated authority of spending from the House of Representatives and trying to kind of aggregate it into the White House. I think the president needs to show leadership. Okay, House Republicans, American people, you're concerned about spending, I'll meet you there, as opposed to finding a dodge that tries to work its way around. And that's a dodge. Meet the American people and Republicans where they are. I think we can get to where we need to be.
I think we can all agree that a debt default would be a disaster. It would affect the economy. It would affect a lot of people out there who are watching right now. You are part of a group of bipartisan senators who have in the past worked out other compromises on infrastructure, on guns, on other issues. Is there a plan B here if we get right up to the moment that a default could actually happen? Is there any sort of emergency legislation to raise the debt ceiling for 2 more months or anything like that, just to make sure that the country does not plunge into this catastrophe?
Well, first, I think, as I said earlier, I think Plan B might first, when is the 1st of June? When is the drop dead date? If it's June 15th, is there really an issue? That would calm down financial markets if the President and Secretary Yellen came forward with that. In terms of the Republican Senate coming up with something, this is between the President and the House Republicans. And that's why it's been so frustrating to see the President on the sidelines. If the Senate comes up with something, the House has to accept it, and the White House does. So why not just put them together? I think Plan B is to get the President engaged.
So let's talk about Social Security, because if a default happens, one of the first things to fail will be Social Security checks to seniors who rely upon them. But as you've been sounding the alarm about, Social Security also faces another threat in just 9 years estimated, insolvency. And the top 2 Republican candidates for a presidency, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, are now both saying they wouldn't change anything about Social Security. Is that disqualifying?
You know, I think if you have a leading presidential candidate, be it Joe Biden, who clearly is saying that, or Donald Trump, pretending to the American people that there's no problem with Social Security, then they lack the leadership to become the President of the United States. By the way, you can fix Social Security and you don't raise taxes on seniors, you don't cut their benefits. And there's a way to do it that actually improves the program. But there's no leadership like that from Trump or Biden. In my mind, that lack of leadership on an issue so critically to so many Americans is disqualifying. So
you have a plan to create a $1.5 trillion fund that would use investment returns to fund Social Security. Again, we're about 9 years out from insolvency estimated. Given how D.C. works or doesn't work, given how we're waiting until the last minute with the debt limit, we're going to go through this again in the fall with government funding. Is there any willingness among your colleagues, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the House, to act now to try to fix this problem?
First, to put this in context, when insolvency comes in 9 years, people who are currently receiving social benefits will get a 24% cut. That's the reason you want to act now. And if you wait until the deadline, then the cuts are bigger and the tax increases are greater. And so if you want to solve it now without that, you need to solve it now. And we actually had bipartisan senators and bipartisan group of representatives that were willing to commit to this big idea. Again, $1.5 trillion in an investment fund, separate from Social Security, and the risk falls upon the fund. If the market goes down, people still get their benefits. No 24% cut. When Joe Biden came out in his State of the Union speech and began to speak about Republicans trying to take away your Social Security, it all fell apart. The president clearly plans to run for re-election, as does Joe Biden, as does Donald Trump, making Social Security an issue, attacking anyone who comes against them. They are ignoring a problem which is important for our seniors, important for our nation's indebtedness. I wish both of them would show real leadership.
Let me ask you before you go, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is anticipated to announce that he's running for president. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott has filed paperwork to do the same. Former Vice President Mike Pence likely right behind them. Here's something Governor DeSantis reportedly told donors on a phone call this week. Quote, "You have basically 3 people at this point that are credible in this whole thing, Biden, Trump, and me. And I think of those 3, 2 have a chance to get elected, Biden and me," unquote. Do you agree with him that Trump cannot win a general election?
Well, a couple things. I don't think Trump can win a general election, but that's a nice way for him to diss people like Tim Scott, who's a pretty formidable candidate. So you just have to take this as a competitor trying to diss others. On the other hand, during the last election cycle, we saw that in all the swing states, almost all, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona, that the candidates for Senate that Trump endorsed all lost. If you had taken the votes that went to other Republicans and put them together, those Republicans would have won. So I think the president's kind of high-profile endorsement of those candidates actually hurt those candidates, at least in the general election. So if past his prologue, that means President Trump is going to have a hard time in those swing states, which means that he cannot win a general election.
All right, Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana. Good to have you back, sir. Thank you so much.